Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all very much for your presence here this evening. I know there's a World Cup going on, so thank you very much. And this workshop is organized by the National Council of Professionals and titled the Policymaking and Governance, Navigating Geopolitical and Economic Challenges. And the event is part of the SJB's policy building process, which involves utilizing both national and international expertise to build the next manifesto, which we think will be applied to our country's administration. In an effort to keep things on time, as you know, we're starting on time, we hope to end on time. So I want to start by inviting the Member of Parliament, a member of SJB's Economic Troika, as they are affectionately referred to, former Minister, State Minister of Finance, Honorable Iran Vikramaratne, to deliver the welcome address.
Thank you. Just to say welcome to everybody here. I want to start by first saying thank you to the National Council of Professionals for the work they have done, not only today, but over the past couple of years. And this is a part of a longer process that they had begun. Also to say thank you to Dr. Erwin Studin and the renowned expert on public policy and governance, to Professor Sajith, who have joined us, joined the leader of the SJB, Sajith Premadasa, and all of us. So we want to say on behalf of the leader and everyone, I want to say a very big thank you right at the beginning. So today we are having this as an ongoing part of our policy making and governance process. Now, Sri Lanka's natural assets like geographical location and the nature's bounty of fauna and flora are well known since ancient times, including in recorded interactions with the Roman and the Asokan empires. While all this can be leveraged for local benefit, no such asset, including modern era human resource capacities of Sri Lanka, will become automatically beneficial to the country unless they are backed by physical, robust infrastructure and internationally recognized, transparent and trustworthy regulatory environment. So for building such physical and regulatory infrastructure, it is best for Sri Lanka to be multi-aligned as a nation, and entities that currently hold and wield global economic levers for us to be very much in conversation and dialogue with them. This requires a sophisticated web of external relationships, not driven by glib rhetoric like we often hear, but a well-thought and carefully crafted foreign relations approach as well. It must be a dynamic policy framework, and I'm talking of all policy here, framework, and not a set of archaic political ideas that are based on habit and presumptuous assumptions of self-importance removed from local and international ground realities. Such a policy approach must be both strategic in content for the long term, and it has to be tactical for short-term gain and advantage. It should be in line with national interests and aspirations of the public belonging to all communities living in this country. So the objectives of this workshop are to gain a comprehensive understanding of the geopolitical and economic challenges faced by Sri Lanka, and we are looking forward to hearing from our speakers, and engage in the discussion on effective policy making and building consensus. Now the SJB, we are the government in waiting, and that's why we are preparing. We seek office to make a difference and not to succumb to populism. This is why we are seeking office. We want to say that merit must become a guiding principle of our government, and particularly on policy making and on implementation. So we have an election to face, and therefore we are going through the process of governance and policy making. So the process involves academics, professionals, experts, the public. It's an inclusive process. We are bringing everybody into it. into this process. So what's the problem? What's the agenda? What are the options on policy? Then the decision-making side, implementation, evaluation, those are for the future, but we must follow this process. I must say the National Council of Professionals have done a lot of work. They have identified, in fact, 27 sectors which they have worked very diligently over a long period of time. So it's an informed policy-making process. It has to fit the 21st century. So as a developing country, we should not have any illusions about current realities, both internal or external. Internal in terms of the state of governance and institutions. This is a challenge that we actually have. Rule of law, economy, human rights, reconciliation, political, military, religious nexus, and the related problems. Climate and environmental realities. Social issues in terms of health, aging population, and the human resource constraints that we actually have. So the external challenges that we have and the realities we have to face up to, externally in terms of understanding Sri Lanka's realities as a developing country, and I know some people don't like when I use that word, right, because we say middle income and there are so many different definitions, but I use it in the sense of the market and skilled human resources. That's where our limitations are. The immediate neighborhood and beyond we need to look, and being able to shed illusions of past grandeur in facing the realities of the current circumstances, because we try to always live in the past, you see, and the country has really, in the last 40 years, we have come down on any scale that you look in the world or even in Asia. So my final word would be this: public policy is the manifestation of government governance in practice. I was privileged to hear Dr. Irwin yesterday also, and other comments there as well, and in what is actually governance and what is actually public policy. So public policy is the manifestation of government governance in practice. Our public policy is often, right, limited but archaic structural issues. So policy is important, but if we don't sort the governance issue, then we are going to be in a problem. I believe that Sri Lanka's number one issue, lots of people come to me because I'm an economist and talk to me, it's not the economy, it's the rule of law. The IMF issued its governance report, the diagnostic. Civil society issued a diagnostic report just recently. IMF sessions are on in Marrakech in Morocco starting today, and now there is going to be a session on the governance reports on Sri Lanka. So good governance is transparency, responsibility, accountability, participation, and responsiveness. Good governance delivers on the promise, and this is Sajith Premadasa keeps emphasizing this. It delivers on the promise of civil, cultural, economic, political, and social rights. The Samagi Jana Balavegya, we don't believe just on the economy only. We strongly believe in all these civil, cultural, economic, political, and social rights. We look forward to the presentations and the discussions that will follow. A happy evening to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Iran Wickramaratne. As he said, Sri Lanka has a unique issue. We've had a policy and a governance-led collapse in our country. So in this regard, to deliver our keynote address, let me just introduce the Canadian public intellectual academic. He's a publisher and a writer, Dr. Irwin Studin. He's also the president of a leading Canadian think tank, the Institute for 21st Century Questions. Dr. Studin has a PhD from York University, a master's from LSE. He's a chair of the Worldwide Commission to Educate All Kids Post-Pandemic, an international initiative to address the catastrophe faced by millions of children ousted from all forms of schooling during the COVID-19 pandemic. He's a founder, editor-in-chief, and publisher of Global Brief magazine. He started his career as an advisor and analyst on a wide variety of domestic and international issues in Canada's Privy Council office, the Prime Minister's Department, and in Ottawa, and on secondment in Australia's Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet in Canberra. He's also the professor and program director at the School of Public Policy and Governance at the University of Toronto from 2009 until 2014, and a visiting professor at leading schools of public policy in North America, Europe, and Asia. So I take this opportunity to invite Dr. Irvin Student. Please give him a round of applause, gentlemen.
Thank you for the kind invitation. Honorable Premadasa and fellow panelists, thank you for the warm welcome, the continued warm welcome to Sri Lanka. I've been all over the world. It's my first time to Sri Lanka, and thank you to Tara Demel and the wonderful team at the Bandaranaike School of Public Policy, the Academy for Leadership in Public Policy, for the wonderful program. I am the president of the Institute for 21st Century Questions, and you might wonder why is it called the Institute for 21st Century Questions, and I tell everyone that the 22nd century was taken, so we decided to stick with the current century. Now, I will also say that I try not to get involved in domestic politics, so my remarks about Sri Lanka will be parametric. I will try to skirt around the edges, and where you push me to be involved, I will offer some humble comments, but I'm here as an observer and a guest, and to report some things also to you, and as I think is your want, you will want to take what you can promiscuously from my remarks and use it for your benefit. And that, is, I think, is the intelligent approach of any ambitious country in the 21st century. But before I do, I will permit myself one little intervention in domestic politics. And that is, I know you have a World Cup happening, right? I'm more interested in the other World Cup, which is the World Cup of football. And I know Sri Lanka is very strong in cricket, but I always ask my South Asian colleagues why Sri Lanka is not very strong in the other World Cup. Why is Sri Lanka so poor in football? And in India, I asked the same questions, and because India is similarly poor, and they said, for a country of 1.4 billion, I said, why are you so poor in football? They said, because the country loves cricket. And I said, that means you can't field a team of 11 players on a population of 1.4 billion. It reminds me of my time when I was at Oxford University. I played football. I was the only colonial player, and we would come out on a rainy day, much like today, but it was colder. And they would say, it's a wonderful day for football. And I would say, it's a miserable day. What's wrong with a nice June, July, summer day in the UK? And they say, mate, that's for cricket. So long live cricket, but I hope you improve your football. So a few remarks parametrically before I go to the geopolitics, and I will climax in a way that surprises you, and the surprise will be that I think Sri Lanka could save the world. Now, I will surprise you and maybe impress you, but I will certainly leave you thinking, honorable members, also about the possibility that you can raise your ambitions and your imagination. First of all, I've come to report about the biggest catastrophe of the pandemic period, and it is not public health, to everyone's surprise, it is education. And with Tara Demel and a number of colleagues across 60 countries, we created the Worldwide Commission to Educate All Kids Post-Pandemic, because we realized slowly and then decisively that the major catastrophe of all the catastrophes of the pandemic period was what happened to the young people. Now you say, there are no young people in the room, so why are we talking about young people? Well, because the young people are the future. If we want a future, if you want a future, my country and yours alike. And I'm sad to report that on the hundreds of millions of young people who were destabilized in their education, in many cases ousted permanently from education, the worst consequences were for South Asia. And the most catastrophic consequences of all were for India, which had up to, or if not more than, 100 million children ousted permanently from all education during the closures of the schools during the COVID period. So if you put that forward 5 or 10 years, you say, well, what kind of future can that be, including geopolitically, to which we'll return. We imagine in the West that India and China are the major countries of the world and the major Asian giants of the 21st century. And I say, yeah, but one Asian giant collapsed its education system during the pandemic and the other did not. And unfortunately, Sri Lanka falls in the former category, much like my own country. You collapsed your education system during the pandemic, so there were two categories of children, except for a handful of children that survived non-destabilized. There were children who were ousted permanently from education during the school closures. They didn't have internet access. They were in abusive homes. They dropped out of school because school lost meaning when it went online. We call them third bucket kids. Or kids who stayed in the system and got inferior educations to yours and mine. And those kids, pushed forward 5 or 10 years, will comprise your economy, your human capital, your employability, but also your broken families, your criminal law system, your social fabric, and your political class. So one recovery coming out of the pandemic, and I would commend this humbly to the leader of this distinguished party, is to say that Sri Lanka will, starting in South Asia, but perhaps in all of the world, be the first to declare that it never closes its schools, ever. You never close your schools, except the most extraordinary circumstances. It's an iron line. And secondly, that you will develop over the next 20 or 30 years the most educated society, not just in the region, but in the world. And that's a quick declaration that I think will get attention for the country, but will also get the world's attention, because nobody is yet aware in a guttural sense of the education catastrophe. I'm here to report that it is the biggest catastrophe of the pandemic period. Before I go into geopolitics and how Sri Lanka can save the world, let me offer one more thing that we discussed yesterday at the dialogue at the Bandananaike Academy. And that is that one of the major learnings of the pandemic period was that science and public policy are two solitudes in practice that should be one in the 21st century. We were discussing with our colleagues here that there is a very small STEM presence amongst the graduating classes of the universities in Sri Lanka, and many of them emigrate. There's a large arts and humanities and social sciences presence, but in the pandemic you see most of the decision-making, including to close schools, was coming from the scientific side, the medical officers of health, the doctors, in my country as well. The problem is that the doctors didn't know anything about public policy. Nothing. They didn't know anything about the schools or the economics, regardless of intellect. But they were making decisions about systems they neither saw nor understood, and for which they had no accountability in failure. Now, the public policy side, which does public policy as a profession, and Sri Lanka has historically some of the greatest civil servants in the post-colonial world, certainly at the start of independent Sri Lanka. The public policy people were aware of the economics, aware of the education system, but had no idea what the scientists were saying. They were speaking foreign languages, and that's because the education was separate. So a 21st century proper education should unite those solitudes. A person going to public policy should not be illiterate in physics and mathematics and biology. There's no reason. But similarly, a STEM specialist, the most brilliant mathematicians, should be cultured in literature and philosophy, ethics, social sciences, economics. Right? It goes without saying. It used to be understood in all the classical education systems. And today we must reunite them. That's one of the learnings within the curriculum of post-pandemic countries that wish to do well. So now I'll turn to geopolitics, but I'll sharpen the definition that my distinguished colleague began to take from our discussion yesterday. You are, in many cases, political players, but there's a difference between politics and public policy that I always commend to my students and to colleagues. But it's sharp. Politics, and you have an election within 2 years, I understand, much as we do in Canada. Politics is the contest for legitimate public power. To stay in power and to contest that power and to get into power. That is a contest. What you do with legitimate public power to specific ends or goals or objectives is public policy. Once you're in power, how you use that power for better or ill, hopefully in the public interest, is public policy. And it's a craft, and it's extremely complex. You divided it, I think, in 27 sectors, which, by the way, is more than the number of districts you have. So that's a lot of sectors, so I commend you for that. But that is a discipline. And often confused in some of the greatest countries in the world The political class thinks that public policy is politics, that they get into power and they continue politics, but the contest is largely finished, and the discipline of public policy is its own contest. So when I speak about education, I speak about education in policy terms. When I speak about geopolitics, I also speak about it in policy, except here I'm talking about strategy, which is even higher than public policy, but in that realm. Both of them entail ends and means. So now to geopolitics. What's happening in the world? I can report, notwithstanding what you're seeing in the news and some of the terrible conflicts now in the Middle East, that the world is really embroiled, or has been for the last several years, in 3 tectonic conflicts. First conflict is the collapse of the Middle East. After 2003 and the collapse of Iraq, after the invasion of Iraq, the entire Middle East lost its equilibrium, and that entropy in that system continues. Israel-Palestine is an older conflict, but still it must be viewed in the prism of a larger regional collapse that will be difficult to restabilize after 2003. That original impulse, explosion, continues. First conflict. The second conflict is the conflict between Russia and the West through Ukraine, or the Russia-Ukraine-West conflict, the second major conflict. And it erupted in 2014. And the third conflict is between China and the United States, to some extent China and the West, and that really erupted in 2016, 2017 with the change of administration in the United States. And just as a sidestep, I'm from Canada, so I don't obsess too much about American politics. So when you say, what do you think of that great country to the south of you, I usually think of Guatemala or Mexico or Costa Rica. So I abstract from this, but I will put them forward in the context of this conflict. So 3 major conflicts: the disintegration of the Middle East, the Russia-West-Ukraine conflict, which is terrible, and the China-United States conflict. Unfortunately, they're now bound at the hip. All 3 conflicts, which were discrete in the strategic space, 2003, 2014, 2016-17, are now bound in one. They're overlapping, almost inextricably. And so it's that much harder to solve. You could have solved them perhaps with ideas and strategies discreetly when they were not bound at the hip, they were not overlapping. But now we're in big trouble because the explosion in one energizes the others. And any fix in one must view the others. And when did they join? They joined hips during the pandemic. The pandemic soldered all 3 conflicts together. The Middle East and the Russia-West conflicts were soldered together in 2015 when Russia intervened in Syria. But then the China-US conflict was soldered into the other 2 through the pandemic. And now we're in a real mess. And Sri Lanka's interest is not to get caught up in this, but to think its way through it, to strategize, so that you're not swept away. Because you have one major advantage that we don't have in the West and in Canada in particular. You're in Asia. And Asia, indubitably, and certainly after the pandemic, is the most important continent in the world. It's the rising continent. The United States may not accept it, but they know it. And in Canada, we neither know it nor accept it. But I know it and I accept it. I'm here to report that it's a big advantage for you. So it would be strategically very poor if, in the context of a rising Asia, you were not able to take advantage. You have many neighbors that will become rich and strategically important, and your interest is to become rich and strategically important on your own terms as the sea rises. And if you don't, it's a catastrophic failure of strategy and public policy. Now, to the solution. One of these 3 conflicts has a solution that involves Asia and South Asia in particular. And I'll take a survey of the room. How many of you think that the most soluble conflict of the 3 is the Middle East, given what's happened there? How many of you think that conflict, or the Middle East as a region, of all the 3 conflicts, has a solution? No hands in the room, so you're probably right. That is the most difficult one. How many of you think that China-United States has a solution? That one probably is more soluble if you have responsible presidents. You can reach an equilibrium. But the most dangerous conflict is that between Russia and the West through Ukraine, because there seems to be no solution on the horizon, a limited imagination, and it has devastating consequences. If Russia collapses, which is the most dangerous consequence, it will take half the world with it, because it's a country with 14 land borders and 3 maritime borders. It will take much of Asia and the Middle East and Europe with it. If Ukraine collapses, then Europe is destabilized, and that will touch all of North America. And so you have a destabilized world that will compromise the Asian project as well. Since 2014, I, through the institute I head, and colleagues have been pushing for Asia to intervene diplomatically and through its imagination and good offices to help that conflict. And what does that mean? You'll appreciate in the Russia-West conflict, there are 2 blocks. There is NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. That's the United States, Canada, and most European countries in a block of a score of countries that are militarily a bloc. The competing bloc is the Russia-led bloc called the Collective Security Treaty Organization. CSTO is the Post-Warsaw Pact. They pull at each other, and now they collide. The only way to solve the problem is for there to be an intervening force that will stop the hostilities and create oxygen for a political and diplomatic and economic solution that reconsolidates Ukraine and Russia and reconsolidates Europe. Now, it's very late in the game. This intervening force between the 2 blocs should have been there in 2014. And I was in Delhi in 2014 already pushing this through our good work on the Institute. And unfortunately, Delhi itself couldn't imagine saving the world. So I'm here in the same region to say that Sri Lanka is bigger than Delhi in this sense. How so? There must be a peacekeeping force that blocks the Russia bloc from colliding with the NATO bloc. That peacekeeping force must come from a 3rd continent. It cannot come from Europe and North America, and it cannot come from the former Soviet space. It must be a respected bloc, a respected continent. The only continent that's respected in both Kiev and Moscow is Asia at that level. It must be a neutral country. We're coming closer to South Asia. And then it must be a country with a deep peacekeeping experience, a record, and troops to spare. And now we get closer to India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka. Now, can Sri Lanka think at that level? Because if you did, it would raise not only the imagination of your country, but it would change your image in the world and save the world, well beyond the 20 million people on this wonderful island. Something to consider. A Sri Lankan peacekeeping force, a peacekeeping offer that's pushed by Sri Lankan leaders across the board to solve one of the major conflicts that, in my view, is the most dangerous for the entire century, should it continue. I thank you for your attention. I look forward to the discussion, and I wish all of you well. Estudi. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Student. Ladies and gentlemen, I invite you to give him another round of applause and show our appreciation. Thank you. Next up, we have someone that is described as a legal luminary, Emeritus Professor of Law, Savitri Gunasekara. Professor Gunasekara is the former Vice Chancellor of the University of Colombo and the first female to hold that position. Now, the University of Colombo website describes her as a woman pioneer and a legend in the legal and academic fields of Sri Lanka. It's not easy to get compliments from the University of Colombo, so that's quite something. Her research has made the groundbreaking contributions to various fields of academic research, including children's rights, women's rights, and human rights law. Professor Gunasekara also has a master's from the prestigious Harvard School of Law as a Smithman Fulbright Scholar. She's an icon for women's empowerment and equality in Sri Lanka. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to have Professor Gunasekara here with us to talk about effective policy formulation. Please give her a round of applause.
Honorable Sajith Premadasa, Leader of the Opposition, Dr. Irwin Studin, Keynote Speaker, Honorable Iran Vikramatne, Member of Parliament, ladies and gentlemen. I wish to thank Mr. Rajiv Nanakara and other members of the group of professionals for inviting me to share some thoughts at this workshop on policy making in the context of current economic and geopolitical challenges. At this time, a conversation with the public on public policy and the vision of political parties for the future is indeed the need of the hour. And therefore, I commend the party for initiating this process of public consultation to ensure the participation of the public in the process of policy formulation. I also wish to express appreciation of Dr. Irwin Studin for giving us the benefit of his insights, and it has been a pleasure to listen to him yesterday at the Bandaranaike Center for Policy Studies and today. Sri Lanka and Canada have bilateral connectivity, but we also have professional connections, and I want to remind that Professor Indira Samarasinghe, a member of the Tamil and Sinhala community, has been a president of one of the distinguished and eminent universities in Canada, and also authored a book on the challenges of breaking the glass ceiling with another eminent scholar, Professor Martha Piper, who was president of UBC in Canada. My perception of, I have been asked to speak on effective policy making, and I do so with my experience with a slightly different perspective. Indeed, Dr. Studin's focus on learning loss in this COVID situation is something we have neglected to really examine, and I think the insights offered are useful in exploring that area and seeing its long-term implications. However, I have a different perspective on the link between politics and public policy, because in my work I have a different perspective that indeed both internationally, regionally and nationally, politics has an enormous impact on the formulation of public policy, and I say so with the experience of our own country. I'm not going into the international area of challenges of the geopolitical context, and I'm going to confine my comments to the national situation, because as a citizen of this country with decades of experience, having had the privilege to serve in the public sector, I'm deeply concerned about the very survival of democracy in this country and the need, therefore, for any public policy or any party coming before this country asking for our vote to look at the form of governance that we have had and the need to sustain its future. And in that sense, I believe that politics is really intimately connected with public policy. Debt recovery, economic growth, and sustainable development of our country is indeed linked to geopolitical realities. The demand for support from state creditors, non-state creditors, international financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund are part of our lived experience. The horrors of war in the Ukraine and now in the Israel-Palestinian conflict gives us a disturbing sense of the weakness of multilateralism and the surfacing of bilateralism, and in a sense the downgrading of all the norms and standards that were forged through suffering after the Second World War. And indeed it is ironical that we are celebrating this year the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is the foundation of the Bill of Rights, which is supposed to set norms and standards international done. So it's a depressing scenario. But in that context, I think we need in Sri Lanka to remind ourselves that we ourselves are celebrating 75 years of a form of governance known as parliamentary democracy. And to me, therefore, the concept of linking policy planning to those foundational values of parliamentary democracy and accountable governance to the sovereign people must be considered an imperative embedded in public policy which links with the norms of governance. Recent discussions in the public domain refer to the resilience of the Sri Lankan people. And it is true that as a people, we have survived 30 years of armed conflict, a fratricidal war, the horrendous loss of life in natural disasters, including the tsunami, recent floods and drought, and also the suffering and anguish of a terrible terrorist attack. And despite that, we are a country in South Asia that has changed governments through voting and which has used our franchise regularly to seek to find the rulers who we wish to guide the destinies of our nation. And that the democratic tradition has been strong in the country. In 2018, we had a peaceful transfer of power through a court decision of the Airport Court on the dissolution of Parliament. We had, again, a free and fair election to choose a government and a president. And subsequently, we saw an enormous enormous evidence of a people's power movement that saw the resignation of a president and a peaceful transfer of power through a valid constitutional process. So in that sense, we have to celebrate that heritage. And therefore, we need to celebrate that heritage. And policy planning, therefore, must be based on that foundational value of sustaining and strengthening that democratic tradition and not undermining it. Of course, there has been democratic deficit. We know that the recent IMF report that Dr. Irwin Studin also referred to, which is called the Governance Diagnostic Assessment Report, is important, and it's impressive in its understanding of our realities and the need for course correction. However, this is information that is not new to our citizens, who have lived the reality of a democratic deficit for decades, especially in the post-war period, and we have also seen that this is often due more to our elected representatives than to the citizens of this country. The preamble to our Constitution, I want to read that, says that our elected representatives, and I'm quoting, humbly acknowledge our obligation to our people and commit ourselves to respecting democracy, ensuring freedom, equality, justice for all, the fundamental rights of the people, and the independence of the judiciary as the intangible heritage of successive generations of the people of Sri Lanka. I find that intergenerational connectivity interesting because what I have witnessed in my lifetime is the erosion of democracy as a form of governance and an increasing democratic deficit brought about by a whole cohort of our elected representatives. We do not know the qualifications of our members of parliament because the declaration of their assets or their qualifications is not something we are privy to. And I want to wonder whether our members of parliament have read the Constitution, whether they have read the preamble, and they understand that representation in parliament means the commitment to hold office rather than power. Political patronage and exercise of power is associated with being elected to parliament. And this has had a corrosive impact on all other actors in public administration Because when there is political patronage and an abuse of power, in a chain reaction, others who hold public office necessarily feel that they have to fulfill not their responsibilities, but adherence to another political authority. Policy formulation for me, therefore, must be based on a platform that is firmly committed to reaffirming democracy and the right to people's participation in governments rather than top-down authoritarian visions of a single leader or a group of elected representatives who hold public office for a limited period of time. Policy must be firmly embedded in the Constitution, and the idea of the limitation of power, state power, through constitutionalism. Because democracy and constitutionalism means that state power must be controlled and must be regulated in the interest of the rights of the people. The allocation of a second tranche of support by the IMF, I'm glad, has referred to this, and it's even more encouraging that that aspect of the governance record of Sri Lanka is going to be a matter of discussion. In this context, I would also like to say that the right to vote and change governments is a sacrosanct right in the Constitution. None of the economic imperatives of debt restructuring, bankruptcy, can possibly undermine or undervalue that right, and the mantra of economic growth, attracting foreign investment and debt recovery, cannot provide a rationale for rejecting parliamentary democracy as a form of government, because that has been a fundamental tradition for 75 years in this country, and therefore policy formulation in governance must reinforce that, hence the connectivity between politics and public policy. So if public policy is to be formulated in new proposals, they must be embedded in the Constitution. We must also respect the checks and balances which are embedded in a democratic form of governance, and respect our independence of the judiciary, the jurisprudence of our courts, which has linked the rights of the people to our international obligations under multilateral treaties that we have signed. So this linkage is something that must be appreciated at all levels in the formulation of public policy, because I do not see, even in Parliament, any reference to our treaty obligations when there is discussion of some of the legislation that comes before us. It is not there, and I think this is a gap that must be addressed. So in order to ensure effective policy planning, it is also necessary to have policy coherence. And that is something which the democratic deficit in this country has created, which is we do not have policy coherence. We heard yesterday at this interesting discussion organized by Dr. Tara Dimel, the Public Policy Department of the BCIS, in which Dr. Irwin participated, of impressive reforms being introduced by Minister Sushil Premchand and his ministry. But I ask, how is it possible to talk of this vibrant educational policy focusing on creativity of thought in a country where impending legislation seeks to control social media in such a manner to undermine artistic creativity, critique of government policy through art, through language, through speech, and eroding the fundamental values of freedom of speech, expression, and the right to information, guaranteed by our Constitution, which must surely be the bedrock of educational reform. Where is the policy consistency? And consequently, we need to have, in proposals for public policy, some reflection on the need for an institutional mechanism which will ensure that be it a planning commission or something like Nepal, where you have an institutional arrangement where all public policy is viewed through the lens of constitutional and international commitment. This also means that it is important to create an environment for the rights of the people and to recognizing that executive power must also be based on the protection of the civil and political rights of the people. And to do that, I think effective policy planning must also take a position on this core issue of the executive presidency and the toxic impact it has had at all levels on the polity of this country. That means a position to say that any person elected will commit to dismantle, as president, will commit to dismantle the executive presidency, and just in case you have a situation where your national list is used to bring someone outside parliament into parliament, to combine that with a dissolution of parliament and maybe a referendum for that purpose. But that to me is a crucial foundation of the concept of protecting the rights of the people and the foundational values of democracy, constitutionalism, and our international commitments. Specifically, also it's necessary to say that we do not need anymore the rhetoric on visions of prosperity. We want specifics. We want to know how will this be done. We don't want any more the declarations of what we expect to do and what we will do. So coming down to specifics, I want to flag a few important areas. The specifics must necessarily be the respect for the rights of all communities, majority and minority, in our plural society, the promoting of tolerance for diversity, rejecting majoritarianism that undermine trust and confidence. This must be the basis of recognizing the need to fulfill the promise of the Constitution in the preamble. Superficial and cynical tokenism and suggestions creating an environment for truth and reconciliation must not be embedded in policy formulation. This necessarily then means the concept of inclusion, the concept of rights for all people must necessarily mean the recognition of the indivisibility of right. And I was heartened to hear from MP Iran Wickramaratne that this will be a foundational dimension of any policy proposals of the Sajith party. Because indivisibility of civil and political rights and economic and social rights, again, is a bedrock of democracy. It is something which is not understood because the concept of human rights has normally, traditionally been interpreted as a concept of civil and political rights. And if we see our protest on the streets, what are people protesting about? The right to protest, to express views, is a fundamental civil and political rights. But what are they protesting about? The need for access to the public good of education, of health, of shelter. So this connectivity must be the foundation of policy formulation, and arguments of lack of resources, arguments of national bankruptcy, the need to include foreign investment, let the robber barons come, must not take us away from this path of recognizing the connectivity of civil and political rights and socio-economic rights. This is not an issue of social protection for the vulnerable, the lowest in society. This is a country which has a strong lower middle class, a strong middle class striving to be an upper middle class. They need to have their lives protected. And it's not a question of giving social welfare as benefits to the vulnerable. I beg to disagree with that discourse, And I certainly hope that policy formulation will recognize that and depart from this traditional approach to protecting the vulnerable in the situation of economic recovery. And finally, I would also like to suggest that we need policies to prevent the venalities of corruption and political interference in all public institutions, which has been a lived experience for so many decades. That means that public institutions, be they universities, regulatory authorities like the NMRI, or non-regulatory authorities like schools and universities and health institutions, must be free from the canker of political interference and encouraged to fulfill their responsibilities to the nation rather than their political masters. Part of that, of course, of institutional strengthening must necessarily be strengthening law enforcement, the independence of the judiciary, reviewing the structures for the administration of justice, including the role of the Attorney General and the prosecution authorities, and also clearly having a strengthening of the institutions that have been destroyed, particularly in the last few decades. Policy formulation ultimately then has to be based on these foundational values of democracy and with the goal of strengthening rather than undermining democracy. And to do that, I think there must also be intra-party democracy, which will ensure that the gaps in representation that we have has been a lived experience for the last 75 years are closed. Yesterday we had an interesting presentation by Dr. Rohan Pithyagud on the lost boys, those boys who are falling out of the education system in a country which has more than achieved stunning statistics on women's participation. Despite that, we have 5% of women in parliament, and that is partly due reforming electoral laws today is a huge challenge. But there's nothing to say that you cannot have intra-party democracy, which will ensure a bigger representation for those excluded categories. And maybe if the lost boys are replaced by the lost girls in parliament, and they part 51% of the population has voice, then maybe we might not have the embedded democratic deficit that we're talking about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Sajith Gunasekara. Our final remarks for the evening before we head on to the question and answer session will be made by the Leader of the Opposition and the Leader of the Samagijana Balavegya, Member of Parliament, Honourable Sajith Premadasa, presenting the topic, Are we ready to govern?
Honourable Members of Parliament, Honourable Madhu Bandara, Honourable Iran Vikramratne, Honourable Harsha De Silva, Honourable Harshana Rajakarana, renowned scholar Dr. Irvin Student, preeminent academic Professor Sajith Gunasekara, distinguished participants, friends, ladies and gentlemen. At a time when Sri Lanka is going through multiple crises emanating from the governance crisis, this particular event provides all of us with a unique opportunity of brainstorming, exchanging ideas and proposals with regard to an establishment of a governance structure that would add value to our country and our nation state. In that regard, we believe and we accept that successful governance is an essential prerequisite to establishing a prosperous country. We can basically identify 10 elements, ingredients of successful governance. Successful governance inevitably entails the presence of a clear vision and a set of people-based, country-based national priorities. There needs to be a clear and defined vision for the country's present and the future, and a proper set of priorities have to be formulated, which would align itself with long-term economic recovery, empowerment in all its facets, well-being of the citizens, and the security of the nation state. Second, it is imperative that we have a crisis management strategy that would be able to map out the various crisis scenarios, the ability to identify the solutions and the challenges in trying to extricate oneself from these various crises. We should be able to objectively assess the various crises that the country faces. It could be multifaceted, as it is right now in Sri Lanka. Economic, health, education, environment, social sphere, in the political sphere, as far as the topic of democracy is concerned. We should be able to have a deep understanding of the root causes of these crises and the ability to provide adequate policy resultants that would ameliorate the damaging impact of such crises. So we have to be crisis resilient and prepared. Develop the country's strategies to be resilient in times of crisis, and try to ensure in achieving the relevant policy goals and objectives, that we adhere to the standards of excellence. Third, we need to have evidence-based policies. Policymakers and decision makers need to comprehend the policy cycle in an adequate manner. At all major points of policy making, policy initiation and formulation, policy implementation, monitoring, evaluation and feedback, which is very much lacking in our country. This policy cycle has to be the major guiding principle of all the decision makers and policy makers. Evidence-based policies backed up by verified scientific data. The necessity to use cost-benefit analysis in deciding on policy options. The necessity to negate ill-thought-out policies, which we have had in recent times. Policies that have been primarily ad hoc, policies that have been basic knee-jerk reactions to emerging challenges. Fourth, the governance structure should have experts, specialists, generalists. We need to have a team of people, personnel, with high acumen and higher achievement. It is important to have a team of experts, advisors, policymakers with diverse backgrounds and experiences to help formulate effective and successful policy resultants. The leadership has to be surrounded by the cream of society, the best and the brightest, who can, through their policy inputs and their participation in the policy implementation process, at the highest value possible to all the policy resultants. Fifth, there needs to be greater prioritization of transparency and accountability. The governance process has to exhibit the highest standards in transparency and accountability in the system of governance. This will enable a country such as ours, which is ridden by multiple crises, to ensure that scarce, limited resources are well utilized to achieve the ultimate national goals and ends. Sixth, we need to emphasize, illustrate, and prioritize inclusivity. We should promote inclusivity at the expense of exclusivity. Inclusivity in a variety of arenas, social, economic, political, ethnic, religious, because inclusiveness will provide our country with an order, a governance system that has credibility, acceptance, and legitimacy amongst people of all walks of life. Seventh, resource allocation and budgeting at a time of bankruptcy and crisis has to be strategic, surgical, and implemented in a manner which promotes fiscal stability, fiscal responsibility, and the achievement of policy resultants that are to the benefit of the country. Seventh, international cooperation and progressive external relations. It is very important that we conduct our foreign policy and external relations in a manner that achieves much for the benefit of the country. We need to align ourselves with countries that add value, not merely in the economic and social arena, but countries and nation states that uphold the highest standards of ethics and morality. We heard from the previous speakers of the necessity to prioritize multilateralism in an international society with multiple power centers. Gone are the days of the bipolar world. We are living in a multipolar world with multiple power centers. Sri Lanka should possess the capacity, the capability to utilize and exploit our relationships, which would accrue to us maximum benefits to ensure that Sri Lanka extricates itself from this tremendous quagmire, the labyrinth in which all of us are lost at this particular juncture. Ninth, the necessity to promote meritocracy. Promote meritocracy at the expense of aristocracy, family bandism, favoritism through personal, private, and other relationships. We need to ensure that the rights of our people are upheld, protected, and enhanced. Those tasks must be achieved through personnel who achieve the highest standards of excellence, meritocracy, must be made relevant and must be made part and parcel of the order of governance that we all should develop. 10th and last, participatory government. The necessity to set up structures, institutions, models that enables people to participate in the decision-making processes. We must not forget the fact that when we talk of sovereignty, people's sovereignty is supreme and sacrosanct. It is a people's sovereign right that has to be exercised by those who represent them. The representatives carry out the temporary trusteeship as the intermediate guardian of the voice of the voiceless, of the voice of the 22 million of people in our country. Exchange of ideas, communication, the necessity to inculcate citizenry inputs into the policy decision making process is of great importance in order to ensure that our policy making processes abide by the highest standards in promoting good, sound, fair, efficient and efficacious government. Let me conclude with a Churchillian statement. The distinguished Prime Minister Winston Churchill once stated as follows: "Success is not final. Failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts." My friends, fellow Sri Lankans, let us garner and mobilize all the strength that we have. Hard work, dedication, in order to ensure that our motherland, which is facing a Herculean task at this very juncture, to overcome many challenges. If we unite as a country, representing multiplicities of ethnic, religious, and other permutations, if we can unite ourselves and let unity be the source of our strength, use our national strength to achieve the difficult tasks and objectives that lie ahead. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Honourable Member of Parliament, Leader of the Opposition, Sajith Premadasa. The final session will be the question and answer session for tonight. We will have questions posed to Dr. Studin and our eminent group of panelists. I think it's important to understand the context that the SJB finds itself in every country that has had the kind of economic and debt crisis that we have suffered just in the last 20 years alone. It's always been followed by major political upheaval. So just in this last 20 years, we've seen brand new parties taking power all over, in Europe, in Spain, in Greece, In India, in the 2020 legislative election in Delhi, there was a brand new party that won. There's a party in Poland, the Five Star Movement in Italy in 2018. Even Emmanuel Macron's party En Marche in France was a brand new party. So I think the challenge for the SJB is perhaps to project ourselves as a natural party of government. And this is not going to be easy. So I think it's a good opportunity for our audience to interrogate our panelists and maybe even give your own comments on what we've heard today. So I open the floor to the audience. Yes. I think we have a mic available. Just 1 minute, so we'll get the mic to you.
I want to ask the panel about the social media controls laws that are being introduced and how important this is going to be to freedom and democracy going forward. In the background that the Aragale wouldn't have been possible had these curbs been in place. And also in the background that Sri Lanka in the past 2 decades has seen the murder and intimidation of countless journalists. What should be our response to that?
Sajith Premadasa wanted me to take a jab at it. I mean, it's quite obvious, right? What this law is trying to do is to shut us down, and we must fight with all our might to stay alive, physically stay alive. Because the second part of your question referred to the murder of multiple journalists, and some gone missing. We don't know whether they're alive or dead. The mere idea that the president can on his own appoint a commission, not an independent one, but for the president to appoint a commission and its chairman to determine fact from or truth from untruth, probably is unheard of in today's democratic structures that the Professor Gunasekara spoke about. So it is almost not only it is inconsistent with what we believe in, what our democracy is built upon, but it is so unfathomable that a guy like Ranil Wickremesinghe would want to introduce this. Because the Ranil Wickremesinghe that we knew when we were working with him is not the Ranil Wickremesinghe that attempted to shut the voices of dissent down. I mean, he is the president because, like you said, of the Aragale. So it is contradictory, it is absurd, and like I said, we must all unite, irrespective of our political affiliations, to do whatever it is that we need to do to get the government to withdraw this before it comes to the next stage.
Can I also add to that? The SJB will use all legitimate instruments and avenues available to fight this attempt. It's a draconian attempt to stifle democracy, to silence the voice of the people, and it is an attempt that very clearly exhibits the main ingredients of authoritarianism, autocracy, and dictatorship. So we will fight it, we will fight hard, both inside and outside Parliament, and also in the courts, where we all hope that the fundamental rights will be upheld. And this dastardly attempt at destroying Sri Lanka's democracy will be fought, and we will fight hard to win on behalf of the rights of the people, the rights of the 22 million in our country.
I think we have a question at the back.
Would you like me to say?
Sorry, can we have one more comment on the previous question before we get to it? 1 minute, please.
Yeah,
Yes, if you want
Sorry,
to listen
Dr.
to the
Student.
If you want to listen to the panel for a long time, most certainly.
I'll see, no problem.
No, sir. Dr. Student, you can
I'll
continue.
be quick. I won't interfere in this important debate about whether Sri Lanka should and how it should regulate social media, but I should say it's an international phenomenon. I'm coming from a country that is having a bras de fer, as we say in French, a huge arm wrestle with the major social media companies as we speak. In Canada and Australia had it, and many European countries have had it, and of course Asia has come to different conclusions. So it's a major 21st century question. It's very complex, and let me add a few parameters for your consideration humbly. In Canada, the debate is such that Facebook and Google have stopped Canadians from being able to share any Canadian news at all on its platforms. And this is an attempt to blackmail the government into ceding to its terms. The government in turn has said we cannot lose the battle, because if we do, then essentially this American-based social media companies control the information space in Canada, which is a foreign country. Now, this is not an anti-American comment. I'm very admiring of American industrial achievement, but in Canada, we must control our own information space. So you have one side, the government, one party, which says we will control the social media, and for the following reason, that is, we need to extract from the social media companies certain rents, economic rents, in favor of Canadian media so that they can survive. Otherwise, they are swallowed up, and the social media companies use Canadian content freely. That's one position. Second position is on the conservative side, which says, let it be a free-for-all. The social media companies allow them to operate, and it's a matter of free speech. And my own position is the third position, and I think the correct one. And I have it in a book that's called Canada Must Think for Itself. I know it's a bestseller in Sri Lanka, and the question that must be asked is, who created the social media? Who created the algorithm? Because even Sri Lanka is operating on a foreign algorithm, either it's TikTok or Facebook or Twitter. He who creates the algorithm is king. And he who operates within the algorithm imagines that they're participating in free speech or democracy, but is doing it on the terms of the algorithm maker. And I don't know how this works in Sinhala, and thankfully you're operating mostly in a different language, but in English it's a killer for us. And it results in the following absurdity. At the nadir of the first lockdown in North America, in April of 2020, Canada experienced its largest gun massacre in history in the beautiful province of Nova Scotia. And nobody in Canada knows about it. Regardless of education, none of my well-to-do neighbors know anything about it. It's called the Portapique Massacre. And why do they not know about it? Because they were all on Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and Google, and those are algorithms that we're talking about Kim Kardashian or Donald Trump or American race riots that were popular at the time, and therefore we imagine that to be our reality. It sounds comical, but it's tragicomic, because as the catastrophes of the pandemic deepened, we couldn't tell ourselves our own reality. We couldn't say that the schools are disintegrating and Canadian education is collapsing, because it's not. We're all talking about Kardashian again. I don't know if Kardashian's a celebrity in Sri Lanka. If she is, it's because of the social media. But it gets worse, because in the Arctic part of Canada, which is important to me strategically, I would say what's happening in Northwest Territories or Yukon, what's happening in Japan, how are your businesses? And they would again repeat Kardashian. And I said, it's a reduction ab absurdum. Everyone is on a foreign algorithm. And by the way, the algorithm is made in California, because the developers are there, and they can cut anyone off the knees. So the Prime Minister has to speak according to the terms of the algorithm. He has to use vocabulary that is permissible by the algorithm, otherwise he cannot go viral. He can be cut off at the knees and deplatformed if he says something that's not friendly to the algorithm or not friendly to advertising the algorithm. And finally, he must say something that gets him viral. So if there's a viral movement, he'll want to amplify it. And because Sri Lanka and Canada alike are minor players in the population of the algorithm users, you have to be careful because you can be swayed in. So that's something to think about, because you have to reckon with social media in any ways. But in my case, I say that let it be on your own terms. The best way to do it is to create your own algorithms and make that central to your national discussion. But that's a lot of work.
Thank you, Dr. Student. Professor Gunasekar also wanted to just mention a few remarks.
I just want to share the perspective that if this bill is enacted, it will be the first complete death knell of the system of democratic governance that we know. This is being challenged in court, and the court will look at this from the concept, on the basis of the fundamental rights of freedom of speech, expression, right to information embedded in the Constitution. And the Constitution provides for regulating that, the kind of regulation that Dr. Owen spoke about, but on the basis of its reasonability, the fact that it should be proportionate, and it should not in any way completely undermine those basic and core rights of a democratic region. Now, it's heartening to know the position of the party on this in Parliament. But this requires connectivity and a citizen voice understanding the impact of this on society. And that is where consensus building and networking is so vital in order to at least articulate the idea of naming and shaming those persons who preach democracy and then who are undermining the very foundational rights. That has to become, I think, from an articulate citizen voice, and it is a time for women's groups, professional groups, other groups to get together to articulate that voice and support the commitment of those in Parliament who are not going to vote for this bill. Thank you.
Thank you. And the spirit of free speech, thank you for your patience. Please, we have a question at the back.
Yeah. The first thing I would like to say, and thank you, Honorable Sajith Premadasa, for inviting me. I'm here as an independent professional. I'm neither green nor blue nor red nor saffron, and don't represent either the bicycle, the hand, or the telephone. But the first observation I want to make, Rohan, is I think we should focus on policy making and governance. That's the subject matter here. If indeed that bill which curtails freedom in social media, I would propose to you to have a separate session on that. And I'm quite surprised, just like Harsha is, that a country or a political leader who was associated with opening the economy in 1977, where we have accepted the fact that a market economy needs regulation, but desirable, aware, fair regulation. And curtailing that freedom is in complete conflict with the concept of a market economy, I think. But I would like to comment on, since it was not commented on, this question of governance. Both Harsha and Iran were part, and we outside the Parliament were a part of a government called the Good Governance Government 2015. So what I like to say is that we can engage in policy dialogue, but by now I would have expected the political party that you represent to have formulated all those that are necessary to introduce macro-level governance. And if you listen to the World Bank sessions yesterday, both Georgieva and Kristalina and Banga were speaking about macro-criticality. So it is macro-critical to have a good governance structure. And I would like to share with you, you referred to Kim Kardashian, Dr. Irving Studin. I wouldn't blame you at all. I have worked in Armenia many times and I know how good looking the Armenians are. Kim Kardashian is an Armenian. But in Armenia, the Asian Development Bank invited me to do what was called a JICRA. And it's all about governance. JICRA is a governance, institution, corruption, risk assessment. There were 2 team leaders. I was one of them. I did that in Armenia. Now, what is that? A JICRA is where you take 3 thematic areas of governance: public financial management, public procurement, and anti-corruption. And this is a pre-CPS or pre-country partnership strategy assignment, where they go into a nation, it is a member country now, post-Soviet member country, where they look at public financial management across the country. You look at public procurement across the country. You look at anti-corruption across the country. So there will be public financial management addressed as a generic tool, as what I would now like to call a macro-critical tool, to see how the PFM is operating. Public procurement, same thing. Anti-corruption, same thing. So what you then do is you look at the legal, statutory, regulatory environment. What are the laws under PFM? What are the laws under public procurement? What are the laws under anti-corruption? What are the institutions that these laws enabled? And what kind of resources do you have in institutions to intervene? And having done that, then we looked at the water sector, the electricity sector, the energy sector, and so on. Now, I have sent a letter to the current president when he was prime minister, and also to the then finance minister, saying, get the ADB to do this. Now, the IMF has gone and done a diagnostic assessment revealing to us what we already knew. Right? So I am proposing that perhaps your political party can see how you engage the ADB, because you frequently meet these people, to see how you can develop something so that you hit the ground running like J.R. Jawanda did when he opened the economy and introduced the free trade zone in 1977. What happens now is all political parties, including yourselves, take a long time, Iran, I have discussed this with you. You go into office, you're in the saddle, and Honorable Premadasa, you've been in politics for a very long time. These 2 gentlemen have joined from the professions. I would like to see you guys hitting the ground running much faster. I would also like to touch on a specific health sector, because Member of Parliament Harshan Rajakaruna made an excellent presentation. I think I have shared my thoughts with you on that. Where this whole question of health sector public financial management, health sector public procurement, health sector anti-corruption. You take that sector itself and see how you can strengthen it. So what I would like to propose is that you be in a state of readiness. I'm apolitical here, but I'm terribly disappointed that successive governments, whether it's the government from up to 94 or 2001 to 4, aware governments, when they get into the saddle, they take far too long. So I don't know whether you have 7 or 8 months or 10 months or 2 years. I think it's much less than 2 years, Dr. Irvin. So you have a lot of work to do. So I propose that you have a series of these kinds of policy dialogues and allow the people in the audience to engage you. Reduce your presentations to as much as possible. And you sit in the middle, Kusum, and you moderate the event. Let all the thoughts be filtered and come up with some gems to hit the ground running with implementation, rather than engage in a series of policy dialogues after you take office. All the best.
Thank you very much. I invite anyone on the panel to respond to the comments and the critique of the gentleman in the audience.
Well, I would like to take this opportunity to apprise you of the fact that we have already commenced a process, and it's not a static activity. It's evolving, it's dynamic. We have looked at the main 27 areas of policy, and what you have just prescribed, we have already commenced. And maybe your lack of knowledge on that aspect is your apprehension in terms of participating in that process. So I would like to use this opportunity to make an open invitation to you to be a proactive member of this very process that you have just claimed that we are not doing, we have hit the ground running, and we have been embarked on this process for 2.5 years. And I would like to invite you, because your wealth of knowledge, experience, is most invaluable to enrich the policy making program that we have already hit the ground running.
Thank you. The floor is open to any questions. Yes, sir. Second row over there, please.
As the opposition our leader said, yes, the policy formulation is in process. My question is, once the policies are done, one need to communicate it to the public and make the people aware. From the public perspective, as of today, we really don't know whether there is a policy or not on anything. There may be a policy, but not from government to government, even from minister to minister, the policies keep on changing. How do we, number one, communicate it? Number two, whether it should be a part and parcel of the constitution, then there should be a policy changing procedure to change the policies, because policy is not something that is static. Number three, procedure that we should adopt in case the policies are violated.
Thank you very much for your question, sir. I invite the panel to respond.
I know it's very complex and don't necessarily have answers to all the questions you raised. We're talking about, policy continuity and how do you actually do that, and, how do you, the constitutionality, if I can put it like that. These are very, very complex, particularly on policy. You can have at a very high level certain things, and then of course translation of that. I would something that I'm really grappling myself in the mind, and that's, don't think for a moment that we have all the answers. Grappling in my mind is policy and policy implementation. So we are going through a process that, as you heard, it's a long process, and really thankful to our national professionals organizations. About 2 years of work to get to these 27 policies, several groups, academics, professionals, right? The civil society consultations, and now they want to broaden it even further after doing some of the groundwork in that process. So this, as I said right at the beginning, is a small part of a longer, bigger process that's going on. But on the implementation, let's take now, several things were mentioned here about macro, procurement, anti-corruption, kind of ideas. Now we've got a really anti-corruption law, right? A new law. And I must say that the opposition, we very positively contributed in actually getting the law put in place, strengthened the law. 80-odd amendments were actually moved. Now that law has to be implemented, you see. Now today, I went to the German technical school. I spent more than 3 hours there. 1.5 hours in discussion. 1.5 hours I went around talking to students and going through the different departments of it. And I'm just giving you just an example. I asked a very ridiculous question. This was started in 1959 in Veerahara, basically for the Ceylon Transport Board, to give the technology and to repair their buses. That's where it started. And so I said to them, now where are the Ceylon Transport Board buses? Are they coming for their repairs? And the answer was very quick and immediate. No, sir, they don't come here anymore because they can send it to the private sector and get it done. So I said, I just naturally said, government has so many vehicles. right, throughout the country, right? And your vision statement says you are supposed to be South Asia's leading, technology institute on transport. That's what the vision statement said when they made the presentation to me. They said, no, sir, because it's better, they take it to the private sector and give it to different garages and everybody gets it done, including government vehicles. So I just asked the question, why is it like that? No, sir, because when they give it there, so the person who takes it gets something in return. And this is just a very mundane example, but to illustrate the point of how deep the issue of corruption has seeped through. We only talk at a particular level often. So as I said, I don't have all the answers. We have a law now in place. We have to look at implementation, and we have huge issues, very, very deep, entrenched issues, and that was just an example. And we want to clean it up. That's the intention we are starting it, and I like the suggestion Ranil gave. We will engage the ADB, right? Because maybe on the particularly focus more on the implementation side, and with the other countries, how they have gone about it, and there are lots of examples in this, like, revenue collection, for example, most 75% of Sri Lanka's revenue come from 3 institutions, customs, excise, and, customs, excise, and the inland revenue, right? And, I don't need to tell you the issues there in terms of corruption. I don't need to tell you. How are you going to tackle it? Case studies are there around the world. Different ways have been used to bring it down. Some countries have succeeded. Maybe it's a centralized revenue authority. I mean, there are various things. So maybe we can use the ADB, and thank you for that suggestion. We'll take that suggestion on board as well.
I think we have a question right at the front here. If we can have the mic right at the front.
Good evening. This question is to Dr. Irving, because I listened to your speech very carefully. You gave 3 scenarios. One is Ukraine, the other one is Palestine, the other one is US and China. But I'll go through the first 2. Ukraine and Russia. Why it became important to the world? Because of energy. Because Russia stopped the gas supply. And Ukraine has a lot of natural resources. And then we come to Palestine and Israel. Every time something happens in Palestine, the whole world go nuts because oil prices. Even in Sri Lanka, our president said, the oil prices will go up and all that. But it hasn't gone up. So I'm reading the second line of your heading, Navigating Geopolitical and Economic Challenges. Now in Sri Lanka, we also getting into the same pattern like those countries, because we also have natural resources. And we have found gas in the Mana Basin. We have a huge sea, which is actually our wealth, because we have a little land, but we have a massive sea. And that is actually, I don't have to go into that to explain how much what is the wealth is in that sea. So I would like to, see this geopolitical and, economic challenges combined with the national resources. How are we going to safeguard our natural resources from the big boys like China and India? Now, I think you all gentlemen, now India, they said they're going to develop Trinco with the, green hydrogen, right? And then China is now already here with Sinopec. And they are going to put up thinking of putting up a refinery. But our institutions go to sleep. So eventually, our natural resources will be, actually it will it will not be governed by us in this way. Thank you.
You're drawing me closer and closer to domestic affairs, and I'm tempted, but I'll again be parametric because I come as a visitor, and if a visitor were to come to Canada, regardless of how many Nobel Prizes he or she has, and were to tell us how to live, I would wax skeptically, and I would say, who are you to say that? You don't know. Most Canadians don't know their own country, let alone a foreigner, but you're tempting me, so I'll bite a little bit. A couple of points to recast what I said. Ukraine-Russia conflict is not important first and foremost because of energy. Energy is a factor, but it's important because Russia is the biggest country in the world, and Ukraine is bigger than any country in Europe. And that conflict has nuclear weapons at stake and can destabilize Europe. As soon as Europe is destabilized, the entire world collapses. The project of the European Union 27 today, is not an economic project, it's a peace project, which also, by the way, is a good lesson for Sri Lanka. You lay the peace, you consolidate it through economic sinews, and maybe you can have a good half century, but you see there are explosions that threaten it. So that's the first point on Ukraine, and I'm pretty expert on those topics if you want to press a little further. I never mentioned Israel-Palestine because it's a local conflict. I talked about the entire Middle East, which collapsed in 2003, and that had nothing to do with Israel-Palestine. So I'm not about the news, I'm about the structure of that entire region, which is destabilized not through the current conflict, but through the 2003 intervention. And resources are an important point, but it's such a big region that touches all parts of the world that it can destabilize all regions. Now, as for Sri Lanka, you asked a great question. And my superficial response, how does a small country, by the way, Canada is the second largest country in the world, and we also call ourselves a small country. But how does a small country like Sri Lanka navigate between two giants like India and China? And the answer, again, superficially must be, you must impress them. You better be impressive. And so you must project big, but you must also be extremely stubborn in the mind. And in this sense, you can think about two scenarios. One is that Sri Lanka becomes a vassal state to India, and you just go with the Indian winds. If they say green, you say green. If they say yellow, you become yellow. Yes, sir. In that case, you are pitted to them, whether they go poorly or not. But the most impressive small countries, and these are Singapore, Israel, now UAE, a little bit Qatar, have thought for themselves, and they've projected much larger than their circumstances. And they've been fiercely both independent, solid in mind, extremely stubborn. Look at the Singaporean mindset. I mean, it's like a block of coal. You can't tell them anything. The Israelis are very similar, and UAE is heading in that direction because they benchmark against the other ones. But they're also extremely opportunistic and promiscuous strategically. They're friends with everybody. And the reason they're friends with everyone is, as was said by some of the panels, they are trying to extract maximum rents from all sides. So the intelligent play from Sri Lanka, again, you can tell me if I'm overstepping, the intelligent play is to suck from both teats, China and India and Russia and the United States, all in your own benefit. That's a very difficult game to play, but you'll have to develop a generation of leaders and thinkers who can play that. The interest is not to have any enemies at your size, not to go frontal, but go carefully. I'll give you just one concrete example. When I was at the start of my career, I was on secondment to the Cabinet Office in Canberra, Australia, as a Canadian, the Department of the Prime Minister and the Cabinet. The Prime Minister at the time was John Howard. And my first introduction to Singapore was that they were about to execute a young Australian. It was a very famous case. And as an outsider, I would say there's no way that Singapore will execute this young man. First of all, his crime was minor by Western standards. And secondly, Australia is a giant and Singapore is nothing. and unfortunately they served the young man up on a platter back to the country. They did what they did according to their laws and their logic. Many years later, I would come as a visiting professor in Singapore, which doesn't fancy itself a democratic country in any sense, but boy, do they have arguments. They have very strong arguments. And they've countered all of the critiques, and they have a mindset that is extremely hard because it was necessary to have a hard mindset in order to survive. Now, the only time I'll raise the Israel question is that Singapore borrowed very conspicuously from Israel, because Singapore was in much more dire straits than Sri Lanka today. I think the honorable member of the opposition says you're navigating a labyrinth. It's very true. But Singapore was ejected from Malaysia, and Lee Kuan Yew was almost suicidal. How did they recover? Well, they went around the world and said, what small country stubbornly survived? Well, it was Israel at the time. Israel won wars against a lot of countries, developed a very hard mindset, necessary to survive. So they borrowed from them, and then UAE borrowed from Singapore, and then Qatar borrowed from UAE and Singapore, and Sri Lanka presumably must do the same. Look around the world and see which countries have similar circumstances and survive. But a lot of the survival is mental. It means you have to believe in yourself, even through hardship. And that's a very difficult process.
We have another question in the front row, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much for excellent presentation by all of you. I am General Dr. Boniface Pereira. I have a small note on economic challenges. What is the point of a map if we don't know our own location? And you can never be able to find Colombo 7 house with a map of London in your hand. So the economy is a very vast subject. We have to understand the problems, maybe hundreds, maybe thousands. And we have to define the problem statement. I know our leader, Mr. Premadasa, and all the parliamentarians, Kiran, Harsha, and Ranjit Madhumandara, are out of allegations of corruptions. Number one problem what I have seen is the corruption. Number two being waste. And maybe three, incompetency of people being appointed to various places. And also, voice too important to be left to generals. In the same way, the economy is too important to be left to politicians. Politicians cannot handle the economy all alone. They resort to corruptions. So therefore, we need a big paradigm shift so that economy, like in Japan, like Kaizen theory, it must be the job of everyone. Everyone in the sense, it is the job of all 22 million population. I want some comments. Thank you.
Yes, Professor Gunasekara, please.
I think we need clarity on some of these ideas we're talking about. When you refer to this whole idea of government can't do this, you see in a democracy there are checks and balances, but there are roles for the different institutions. There's a role for parliament, there's a role for the executive, and there's a role for the judiciary. And the whole, in our constitution, resource allocation is a responsibility of parliament. So the management of the finances also could be part of the executive, but there's a role for the legislature. So also there was a question on policy formulation. It is a role of the legislature and the administration to formulate policy. The implementation is part of the executive responsibility, not that of the legislature. And that's where we have failed, because that would involve the rule of law, administration of justice, and other institutions. But we must be clear about those roles. And when we talk of policy, the bills that are before Parliament on the media control, that's policy. It is policy that is coming from government and manifested in legislation. And they are fulfilling that role of formulating policy. But let us also remember that if we look at our past, many of our gains in education, providing access to education, access to health, there's no legislation. There were administrative policies carried through with resource allocation on the basis of governance and implemented administratively. So you don't necessarily have to have legislation, but that's a task of the legislature and of the administration. And we must be clear about that. You can't have another organization in a democracy taking over the financial responsibilities, etc. Policy is formulated by legislation, by acts of parliament, or it can be administrative, by the executive, which we have had in this country in the case of health and education. You look for the statute books. There is no law which gave us access to education. Even the Constitution doesn't give that. So I think we must be very clear of who formulates policy, what institutions formulate policy, and what is the role of policymakers. Otherwise there is this confusion, and I think it's important to understand that, because otherwise when we talk of the fact that national resources must be allocated by other parties, then you're really contradicting the foundational values of the structures of governance. Thank you.
We have another question over here.
It's more than a question. I would like to make some comments about some of the issues that were discussed a while ago. I think the success of a country depends mostly on the rule of law. And that was the success story of Singapore. And that's the success story of many other countries. This is something that we are still in search of in this country. And also, we have many institutions that are to ensure that the laws are implemented, at least the policing or the forces or maybe the bribery commission is set up. Now the new commission that is to be set up for the last 1 month, we have not been able to constitute it. But now when we talk of corruption, we always look at the politicians. But is that the only place where corruption takes place? No. Sometimes the politicians, when they enter the parliament, they enter with a genuine kind of a desire to do some good service to the people of the country. But we hardly talk of the bureaucratic corruption that takes place in this country. It was not long ago that a key official, a president's secretary, was taken into custody, trial at bar, convicted and jailed. So recently another ministry secretary was taken into custody. He was bailed out, but he is still in service. In a few weeks' time, there will be another ministry secretary who will go behind bars. But these people still continue in office. And most of these people, even if you do not talk of the macro level, even at micro level, most of the officials, they do not do what they ought to do, the duty. Why? Because whether they do it or not, they get their promotion, they retire, they get their pension, they are fine and happy. And that the chapter is closed. The statutory functions that are to be executed by such people, when they are not executed, that should be made part of the laws with regard to corruption. Be it the investment process, be it the administrative process. Now, how many times we have had situations where the courts, the apex court of the country, have faulted high officials, maybe police officers. They are faulted. Maybe some 25,000, sometimes 10,000, sometimes even more than that. He is ordered to be paid by him personally. He pays that, but he still continues in office. Politicians, they are faulted. They are asked to pay some compensation. They pay that, but they still hold office. But is that right? So we have to have a fresh look at this kind of situation. Whether be it politicians, be it officials, the administrative involved in the administrative process, there must be some new laws to be drafted in this SJB. I propose that we must change these laws to have an effective system with regard to the apprehension of these wrongdoers. One other example I would like to give, I think most of you may be aware that there was this issue of Greek bonds. Greek bonds was complained to the Bribery Commission in 2011. And that investigation is still going on after 12 years. So, can we be happy? What have we done? There have been successive governments. There have been successive governments that have gone through after the complaint was made at the Bribery Commission. I think there must be a commission appointed to probe the Bribery Commission. There was, it was very recently that a decision was taken with regard to the Express Pearl disaster by the Attorney General to file action in Singapore. The excuse that was given was that if we file action in Sri Lanka, they may not come. Well, the legal process is very clear. If they don't come, there will be ex parte orders. And then comes to the implementation of the orders. The companies are either registered in UK or in Singapore. Then there is a reciprocal enforcement of judgments. Reciprocally, they can be enforced. There is a law that's between Sri Lanka and Singapore. There is a Commonwealth country, as Commonwealth country, and Sri Lanka and UK, there are laws. We can have them enforced. But in the contrary, there was a case that was filed, or rather more than one case that was filed, in the Commercial High Court, and it has now gone to the Court of Appeal because there was another application was made by Revision and Restitution and Intercom. There, all these parties were made respondents. All these parties are represented in court. So that argument has fallen apart. Now there is a limitation of claims between, there is a treaty signed between Singapore and UK. But we have not, as Sri Lanka, we are not signed to that treaty. We are not signatories. So the best place to file action would have been in Sri Lanka, which we have failed. And the 2-year time has now passed. There are also instances where sometimes a small claim, court orders, the Commercial High Court, maybe they order for the payment of sometimes 10 million rupees. There one instance, the appeal lodged immediately. The appeal took about another 8 years' time for the appeal to be concluded. Finally, the appeal was dismissed by the Attorney General. The appeal that was filed by the Attorney General was dismissed, came back to the original court, sought the writ to be executed for 230 million. So 10 million that had to be paid, finally now has snowballed to 230 million. They still didn't pay it. That was, I think, some buildings department or some department. They waited for another 6 years and they paid the 230 million. So then the judgment, the award winner, they said, thank you very much for the 230 million, but now there's another 130 million damages, interest. So that too had to be paid. They negotiated and paid half of it. In another matter, there was another 100 million that was awarded to be paid by the Commercial High Court. Appeal has taken more than now 15 years. Now it has snowballed to 2.6 billion. Who is going to pay for this? It's the public. It's the public money that has to be paid, advanced, and then paid to these companies that are making such claims. If we are serious in attracting investments into this country, if we are not adhering to even the judgments of the apex court, if you are just ignoring the judgments of the apex court, as it happened in the local government elections case, officials are charged on contempt, but bandwagon moves on as if nothing had happened. The Supreme Court has given a very clear order. It has not been honored by the Treasury Secretary. He still sits there as the Treasury Secretary, and nothing has happened. The order is yet to be given, but we have increasing hope on the Supreme Court that they will do the right thing as the days pass by. So unless and until if we do not establish the rule of law, I think there is no future to this country.
So, ladies and gentlemen, we have one last question, and it's the gentleman in the second row.
Thank you. I have 2 comments and also 2 questions. Comments with regard to policy making and also governance. Policy making, who are the policy makers? I think that was not touched properly over here. That is political executive, to my understanding. It's the job of the political executive to make policies consider the will of the people, those who have got elected to public position. And as the political executives, that's a conventional definition with regard to policymakers. Then when you come to policy making, then of course you have to, I think that was discussed over here, policy implementation. Who are the people who are responsible for implementation? Basically bureaucracy. Whether we like or dislike bureaucracy, now of course we have private sector also, NGO sector for implementation, but basically policies are to be implemented through bureaucracy. So that is what he has said, corruption with regard to bureaucracy. But when you look at corruption, both are included, political executives and bureaucracy. I don't deny that, right? That's there. That's the comment with regard to that. Then when you come to governance, I think Mr. Upulja Surya touched rule of law factor. I think there are other principles as well. The transparency, accountability, then who is responsible for that? Because when you say good governance, there are 8 principles. Then that is, when you come to governance, of course, where is the commitment? Implementation, policy making, commitment should come from the political leadership. Political leadership, if there is no commitment on their part, we can't anticipate any implementation of any good policy making. So that's there. Then of course, that is not my question, that's coming. Question part, I have question with regard to ongoing economic crisis. Then of course, I think all the political parties have agreed to work with IMF. But I have some reservation. Because IMF policy is basically on this how to balance the expenditure and the revenue sectors. That's what the balance of payment issue they are going to address. Then what they have recommended up to now, right? If you want to close the balance, you have to increase the revenue. They have said increase revenue, but they haven't. I think they haven't not directly touched the expenditure part. When you say revenue part, what the government has done, they said, okay, we better increase revenue. Then how to increase revenue? Increase taxation. What is the outcome of taxation? What is the outcome of taxation? Maybe now, those who are supposed to pay more, they have left the country, professional basically. I think I would like to request Honorable Leader of the opposition to make a request to the people who are about to leave the country, don't leave, because your services are required for the prosperity of the country concerned. If they are leaving, then who is going to fill their vacancies? Because are we to import professionals, doctors, maybe IT people, engineers, are we to import them? Then of course, who is going to pay them? So therefore, I think it is very much better to make an appeal to those people, wait at least for 1 year. Then new government will address that issue. So maybe reasonable answer to their grievances concerned. That's somewhat. Then of course, with regard to IMF, they are always thinking of, and they are also recommending austerity measures. Cut. That's what they mean. Cut. And also increase taxes. Increase taxes, what has happened? Then investors, SME people, they have expressed their grievances saying that at this high rate of interest, we can't borrow money. And there is no way for us to invest and increase. If you can't invest, then of course, how do you generate employment? It's a simple economic, you don't have big theories for that matter. Then that is the case. If that is the case, then of course, if the interest rates are very, very high, the outcome is that SME people, they have closed down. They have closed down, or some of them, they have taken their business out of the country concerned. That is the outcome. If that is the case, what is the expansion of the economy in that case? We can see contraction of the economy. Because not only Sri Lanka, because Sri Lanka is not the only crisis, country which has made this economic crisis. Other European countries, Spain, Greece, Italy, then Ireland, they have also gone through this mill. Even South American countries, they too have gone through mill. IMF has intervened and give their formula. Nothing has worked there. Still they are struggling. So if that is the case, whether there is any possibility, my question is to expand the economy rather than this contraction and austerity measures. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So for our final remarks from the panel, in response to the last 2 questions, I invite the panel to make some comments. Dr. Harsha, would you like to?
Sure.
Regarding the IMF austerity, perhaps?
Mr. Anaga's question is valid. There's two schools of thought. You see, you can't have the cake and eat it also. Fundamental fact of life. The interest rates had to go up to slow down the economy. The interest rates went up to 34%, and it has come down to low teens. Hopefully, treasury bill rates will fall to single digits sooner than later. Now, what's going to happen is, with the agreement to make the central bank independent and them not allowed to purchase treasury bills at the primary auction, there might be a competition for funds to be obtained by the treasury, which might, in the short term, increase interest rates again. But that is the price we have to pay for the money printing exercise that we have been following for quite some time. Right? So that is the medicine that we have to take. Now, on the point that IMF's prescription is to contract the economy and to cut expenditure and increase revenue, you see, a country of our size and our level of development should be having about 20% of GDP as revenue. The last time we had that amount of revenue was when Mr. Premadasa was in office. That was around 20 to 21%. Ever since, with the ideological shift of cutting taxes, giving tax breaks willy-nilly, the taxes have come down to about 8%, sub 8%. So we have to increase revenue to the state. So where does the state accrue revenue from? Where? It is taxes. Now, the issue is, are these taxes equitable? That is the point. It is not that we have to tax. Now, for the SJB, we have proposed, no one else have done so thus far. We now have the data to prove that the 36% marginal tax rate at 350,000 rupees has been excessive, and that their assumptions were wrong. And the 24% tax starting at $800 a month was wrong. Right? Now we can prove it. We're not just talking, on a political platform without evidence. The Honorable Leader talked about policy, evidence-based policy. So we have now proposed 3 possible alternatives to revise the payee tax. Now I'll give you a simple fact. The objective of the government was to raise 100 billion rupees in payee tax. Now at the end of last month, how much have they raised? 107 billion. And at 70% compliance, they will raise 125 billion. At 100% compliance, they will raise 170 billion. Which goes to show that if you are compliant and if you pay your taxes, where you have no possibility not to pay because the accountant deducts the tax before it goes to your bank, then you can collect the money. Right? So based on those numbers, we can adjust it and we can show that at a 24% tax rate, you can collect the 100 billion rupees. And we will prove it, and we have challenged the government to disprove us. And this came out after a discussion we had with 42 trade unions, professional trade unions, doctors, engineers, architects, lawyers, etc. Right? Not lawyers, but others, etc. Now, if you look at the voluntary payment of taxes, which is the personal income tax, the target was 115 billion. How much will we end up collecting at the end of the year? Maximum 40 billion. Now, why is that? It's because people are not paying. So it is really, why are the people not paying? I mean, whose responsibility is it to pay? Now, of course, people can say we are not paying because the government is misusing the money, wasting the money, corruption, all of that. Right? So that is a longer term problem to deal with and show that there is transparency, accountability, all the good things that we need to do, we must do, so that there will be credibility and people will be willing to participate in the citizen responsibilities. Right? But there is no other way. So in the short term, I'm sorry, Mr. Ranuge, even in our own blueprint, we had said in the short term there is going to be some pain we'll have to incur, right? Because if there is any other way, please provide that to us, right? And IMF is not something it was created only to bail countries out. How we are going to develop these countries, our responsibility. That is what the Honorable Leader said. It has to be our vision. How are we going to create wealth in this country, right? And if we create wealth in this country, incomes go up, then collection of taxes, even at a lower rate, will fill the coffers, and it will bring the collections up to 20% of GDP, right? So therefore, I am not going to shoot the messenger, right? The message is what we need to take. It doesn't have to be the IMF. It never had to be the IMF, right? It is us. It is who made policy, who sort of said, look, we don't need to collect these taxes in 2019 November. Who said we are going to get rid of pay tax? Who said we don't want the VAT from 8%, from 15%, let's bring it down to 8%? Who said let's get rid of withholding tax? Right? Those were knee-jerk reactions, like the Honorable Leader said, without any evidence, without any analysis. These policies were implemented by bureaucrats who never asked the questions. And like Professor Gunasekara said, it is the job of the legislature under the Article 148 of the Constitution to ensure public finance, proper public finance. How do you allocate resources? Did the legislature ever consulted before these taxes were reduced, etc.? So these were executive actions. These were policy changes that were done completely in contradiction to what we are talking about today, right? So those need to be corrected. There is no easy way out. I'm not going to stay here and say, look, the SJB has some magic wand that we can immediately increase government revenue to 20% without taxes. So it is more that we have an equitable tax structure, but the real issue is tax administration. We are today fighting a case on corruption in alcohol stickers. 80 billion rupees lost according to the Minister of Justice because of the counterfeiting of alcohol stickers on these bottles. Right? So so that is taxes foregone. That is taxes that the government is not getting. Without taxes, we can't spend on education. Without taxes, we can't spend on healthcare. Without taxes, we can't spend on transportation. Right? So that is the overall response to you, Mr. Ranuge. We can discuss, but if there is anything else that you may want, you have some other alternative proposal, please bring it to us. We are open to discuss. Right? And just just one last point beyond this on what Dr. Studin mentioned in Canada. That is about the online. It's the Facebook online news matter, where it is more commercial transaction when they use the local news in Canada for Canadians to use. A fee needs to be paid. And this one is completely different, where a commission is going to be set up in order to determine the truth from untruth. So there's a slight difference there. We don't have time to talk about it, but we can offline. Thank you.
Just to add to what Harsha said. Just to add to what Harsha said, it was all revenue-based discussion, but I was a little bit surprised that the last IMF program will be fiscal consolidation based on revenue. I would have thought that they should have looked at cost as well. We have limited resources, and therefore cost has to be looked at. There has to be a discussion in this country on the budget, on the appropriation bill. Where are we actually putting our money? We have to really look at this because we have limited resources. Are we going to put in hard infrastructure or soft infrastructure, education and health? I mean, this is clear. 14 years after the war, we had to look at expenditures, large expenditure on defense, large expenditures on the public service, and all this needs to be looked at. So that's on the expenditure side. The other point I would make is, here, Harsha talked about the stabilization phase, and it's inevitable, all the arguments that were put. Then on the growth phase, ultimately, you have to have savings, and then you have to have investment. Then you need to have it either in rupees, or you need to have it in foreign currency. Basically, foreign direct investment and investments coming in. You have to have the environment for it. And as we heard about the rule of law, situation, Sri Lanka was in the last I saw was like 99 on the ease of doing business, 164 on the enforcement of contracts. We have a problem. We have a problem in attracting investment. Obviously, we need to correct it. Then that is one. Corruption was very, very strongly and well articulated. Right? That's another issue that really you have to put to bed. The issue I want you to really raise here is, I don't know whether it's psychological. Sri Lankans have a psychological fear on foreign investment. You may or may not agree with me. Right? We have a fear. Maybe we've been a small island, we have a long history, right? But we can't really accelerate economic development without investment. And we have to figure this out. And this is where our foreign policy comes in. We have to make choices. Are we going to be a vassal state of India? And then our problem is solved in a sense economically. But we are not going to be a vassal state of India. We are making choices about our lifestyle. We are making choices, right, based on our history. We are making choices based on the democratic way of life we want, and on the independence we want, on safeguarding our culture and safeguarding our lifestyles. Those are choices we are making. Then we have to have a multi-aligned foreign policy, and we have to do this very carefully. And I didn't like that word you saying that to grow you might have to be promiscuous. That word was mentioned and I don't like that word. But I clearly take the point. We have to be crafty. We have to be crafty. We have to be smart, you see, in actually attracting that. Because when the question was asked about our sea resources, right, and I'm saying this again as a think point. I'm not saying this as a policy point. We have to really think about it. When phosphate was discovered 20 years ago, I was in the National Development Bank, and proposals came for value addition. So much of opposition was created. I went there personally myself. And when I built a house a long time ago, they didn't have a concrete machine where they put it in a concrete machine. They brought the cement separately, they bought the sand separately, and there was like a daller. They did this through the daller, and at the end you got some, clean sand, and you put it together, mix it, and only my house was made. That's how we were handling phosphate. I went there, saw it to myself, and I was wondering, how do we actually do this? Even resources, even if they are natural, they have a validity in a particular point in time. And their validity and their value will change over time. 1970s, Middle East, oil changed the Middle East. And it was basically a natural resource, how it was being used. Today, technology is changing things so much, particularly, I saw recent inventions on, I don't like killing animals, but then protein, people want to consume protein. And recently I saw that actually protein could be grown, right? And new technologies have come. So even resources, we have to think carefully. We have sea resources, and you raised that point, right? How are we going to actually exploit it to the benefit of our country? We need to think very, very carefully. We will need technology, we will need investment, and we need to have a policy which safeguards our lifestyle, our independence in actually doing it, and also being smart enough, as doctor said, being promiscuous or whatever, enough to make sure that we can make it. Green hydrogen, example. There is a roadmap the present government has drawn up on green hydrogen. Some of those specialists and experts they are in the earlier government as well, right? And so they have a long roadmap, and this is really in a very preliminary stage. But because of the natural resources, again, wind power, solar power, sea power that Sri Lanka has because of its location, how do we actually exploit it over time? And the technology is changing. If you can start actually retaining it, right, then it becomes a big export eventually for us. So there are so many things to think about in the policy area, but also so many inhibitions that we have, which we will have to think how we are going to actually handle it, or we are not going to handle it. You want to comment?
Yes. Sir, can I add a little bit to your... When I say the resources, sir, the world is changing. Now the world is actually the new technology. And today, the future, transportation, everything is going to be battery or, hydrogen. Now in the US, the natural resources like lithium, cobalt, nickel, palladium, all these have taken over the world. Now, pretty soon there won't be demand for oil, because even the Saudis are going for solar, and they are going to make hydrogen, and they can make a lot of hydrogen because they have the sun, they have the green energy more than anybody else, because they have wind and solar. It's a massive country and a desert, because I worked in those countries, and I worked in the oil and gas industry plus the renewable energy. So I know what I'm talking, and I think we have to save our natural resources for us to survive. And especially we have for us to get out of this economic turmoil, we have to go for the new technology.
Thank you. I think Professor Gulseka has some comments as well.
Just to respond to what Mr. Premadasa said and also you said, I think the fears, or you call it paranoia, maybe, about foreign investment is because there is no guarantee that that kind of investment will not repeat the exploitation of history during the Industrial Revolution. So that during the Industrial Revolution, that no holds barred investment by the private sector without looking at the rights of the people can be very destructive. Indeed, in 1978, I remember late President Jayawardena saying, let the robber barons come. And the robber barons did come. And the free trade zone was a center of enormous exploitation of women workers. Women were being clocked for going into the toilet. And it was the women's groups of the country and the democratic space available that enabled them to fight for decent work in those areas. So consequently, there's a whole new discourse on business and human rights. That means to say accountable business practice, accountable foreign investment, conforming to the norms and standards of, for example, the ILO, the National Constitution on Worker Rights. And it is in that context, I think, that those who suffer that exploitation are extremely conscious of the need to balance the concept of investment, economic growth, with the concept of worker rights. And when we call ourselves a democratic socialist republic of Sri Lanka, I think we can call ourselves with pride a country that has combined the best of the democratic traditions with some of the best of socialism, which ensures not authoritarian governance, but the well-being of the people to access to national resources. And the Epavala phosphates case, my late husband appeared in that case. Justice Amarasinghe gave a wonderful judgment where he talked of intergenerational rights and said exploitation and investment cannot trump the international rights. And that was a basis for the decision on the Epavala phosphates. I am not an economist, nor am I someone from the agricultural section. I really don't know what the value of those phosphates were. But it's a concept, and I think a concept that deserves protection. Thank you.
Thank you. And for our final remarks today, I want to invite our guest, Dr. Student, if you want to make some final remarks as well.
Very quickly, give you the microphone.
I won't be long, and I hope my Canadian accent is not getting in the way of comprehension. We Canadians tend to think we have the highest English. I think along with Sri Lankans, we are the most comprehensible. The Australians and the Americans and the Brits are somewhere lower down the pecking order, in my humble view. Someone needs to still... We talked about 166th ranking. I think the football ranking is lower. But I want to just segue on the notion of democracy, and I think that was elegantly said. Maybe I'll summarize some of the very good interventions from the floor. Sri Lanka will need to find its own way under the democratic aegis and create your own democracy. Democracy is a concept, but the leader of the opposition very eloquently quoted Churchill, and I'll quote him again. He said, democracy is the best system in the world, except for all the others that have been tried from time to time. So that's a de minimis appreciation of democracy, not de maximis one. It's not a system from God. It's just the best system we have amongst the other ones that have been tried. But there are many definitions of democracy, and the distinguished professor offered one. But in my humble submission, the main virtue of democracy is twofold, and take what you will from it. First of all, you have elections to determine succession, rather than fighting wars. This is the problem, the central problem between Russia and Ukraine and in the former Soviet space. They have a succession problem. They have mostly fake elections in most of the countries, and each leader fears for what happens after he or she leaves leadership, or how he leaves leadership. As someone told me once in Ukraine, you can leave office, but you will probably go to prison or death or exile. And that is a cardinal fear that shouldn't exist in most established democracies. So that's the first point. But even more importantly, the feedback from the population that non-democratic countries do not enjoy. That is, democracies should, if they're well-functioning, hear from the people on a regular basis, starting with the political level, and this is where policy meets with policy making, in order to correct mistakes. Because you can have the most clever people in the room, but as the Chinese cleverly say, the emperor is very far. So the emperor in Beijing is very far from Chongqing. So the emperor can have 20 degrees in many areas of expertise, but there's no way he knows what the lay citizen in Chongqing thinks. And just the same in Ottawa, you can nary know what somebody in Montreal thinks, or someone in Yukon or British Columbia, and probably the same, humbly, between Colombo and Kandy and Jaffna and so on. So hearing back from the population on an ongoing basis, even though you have the best people in government, is one of the arts of democracy. In the pandemic, we lost all of that. It was decree, decree, decree in many of the best democracies in the world without any feedback. And this is where I go back to the social media point, that if you lazily communicate decrees from the center to the population and say the policy is made, take it, but don't have an intelligent mechanism for gathering feedback, you will make terrible mistakes of policy and administration. And you will lose not only legitimacy, you will have terrible outcomes that could only redound to the disbenefit of the population. So Sri Lanka will need to find its way. It will need to think for itself, I think, as have been made. And humbly thank you for welcoming me, and I wish all of you well, and it's been a real honor. Thank you.
I also invite the opposition leader to make some final remarks.
I would like to make a few comments in the context of the suggestions made by Mr. Ranugge with regard to economic policies. He mentioned the fact that there needs to be an appeal to the professionals to remain in Sri Lanka. We have done that on many an occasion, and the initiation of the opposition, Honorable Eran Wickramaratne, proposed an adjournment motion. There was a full-day debate on the issue of professionals leaving the country, brain drain, and we take your point, and we will continue to make that appeal to the Sri Lankan professionals to try and remain, and we will illustrate to them that there is light at the end of the tunnel. Now, as far as economic policy is concerned, we all have to be very clear on the path that we as an opposition party has formulated. I want to make one thing crystal clear. We don't practice extreme capitalism, nor do we practice extreme socialism. Ours is a hybrid of capitalism with a human face, inculcating the social democratic ideals of equitable redistribution of resources, wealth, and income. Years of studies and statistical reports exhibit the disparities and the discrepancies, the mismatches that you have in this whole concept of economic growth. The 2016 Household Income and Expenditure Survey illustrates glaringly this division that exists in society. So ours is the middle path. The middle path where we encourage entrepreneurship, where we promote the social market economy, where we fervently believe that private enterprise and entrepreneurship forms the fulcrum of the economic growth engine. But we are also cognizant that we cannot leave everything for supply and demand to determine, because the perfect free market system creates anomalies. It creates social externalities. You have social costs. This is where you come in with the limited government intervention in the name of the social welfare state. We have to understand, for the functioning of a social welfare state, you need to have funds. You need to have money. And you have to generate the money. So the problem that I have with the formula that the government has presented is this. Yes, we have a huge problem with state revenue. The government has decided that increasing the tax rates as the main avenue of raising revenue. But the government has embarked on hiking the tax rates, not in an economy where the government is promoting growth, but the government is promoting contraction, not growth. So in a contracting economy, the attempt to raise greater revenue creates humongous challenges and it creates humanitarian issues. The fault that I see in the government policy is that the government has focused primarily on this approach of raising taxes as the main avenue of raising revenue. Successive governments have ignored the famous Tax Commission report. Of course, they champion it when they are in opposition. Soon as you come to government, you shelve it, because there are inherent obstacles for the implementation of the Tax Commission report. The proposals that are mentioned in those reports illustrate the avenues in which we can improve tax administration. There is no attempt to improve tax administration on the part of the present administration. There is also no attempt to ensure that the so-called tax exemptions that have been given are properly examined. In one of the recent occurrences in the parliamentary committees, a particular set of officials were asked as to why this particular company, foreign company, were given tax exemptions. For what reason? What were the benefits to the country? The reply of the official was that he needs time to consult with the investor to give a reply. So the officials who are mandated with the responsibility of giving tax exemptions need to consult with that particular investor to explain and illustrate the fruits of that particular exemption. So we need to, in addition to examining the tax administration part, we need to look at the tax exemption side and look at the benefits and the costs of those particular exemptions. It's quite simple. If it accrues adequate benefit, more than the cost, we can maintain it. And if it is otherwise, you can reverse it. And that can be a source of state income. Third is tax evasion. Why can't we have a policy of ensuring that those who are liable to be taxed, they have a moral and legal duty. They are duty bound to pay their taxes. Recently it was revealed in one of the parliamentary committees that 2 liquor producing companies, they had evaded to the tune of Sri Lankan rupees 1,700, 1.7 billion in tax payments. So these are 3 areas in which the government has very conveniently avoided paying attention to, and they are hell-bent on using the upping the ante as far as the taxes are concerned. As far as the various observations that we have in the government's economic policy, we see there is an inherent unfairness and injustice in the way the government implements its policies. Just look at the local debt restructuring arrangements, so-called famous domestic debt restructuring, or as the government calls it, domestic debt optimization. All I can see is that the optimization has happened as far as the ruling elite is concerned. Now, in this DDR process, the government has very conveniently ignored the primary dealers, the super rich, those who earn supernormal profits, from making their sacrifices, taking their responsibility as far as the local debt restructuring is concerned, and lump the whole burden on the working people of the country. Now this is a glaring example of what I would call crude capitalism, crony capitalism. The primary dealers may have the opportunity of making greater financial contributions for political campaigns. And since we are in the cusp, hopefully, of parliamentary and presidential elections, even though there are lots of rumors running around to say that there are attempts by the president and the government to create a similar fate to the presidential and the parliamentary vis-a-vis the fate suffered by the local government elections. Be that as it may, the super rich were totally excluded from the domestic debt restructuring program. Now, that is unfair. Quite right, we have to bear costs because there has been mismanagement. There has been grave weaknesses in the governance processes. So there are costs to be borne. However, we have to have proportionality. All have to bear the costs. The rich and the powerful cannot enjoy a comparative advantage over the working people of the country. So that's where we are different. That's where we are cut above the rest. We will practice humane capitalism, capitalism with a human face, inculcating the wealth-generating qualities of the capitalist system, but also the redistributive justice, social justice, fairness, equity, which are principles that we will make part and parcel of our economic policy.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your patience. So just before we wind up, I think the Honourable Member of Parliament, the Leader of the Opposition, has a small token of appreciation to present to our guest, Dr. Irvin Student. I'd like the audience to just give them a round of applause and the entire panel as well. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We have some dinner available as well, and hope you'll join us. Thank you very much once again.
I take your point on the social media. We have that dimension too. It's very much part of the